The Johnson family seemed like any other suburban family. From the outside, they appeared to have it all: a beautiful home and a quiet neighborhood, a well-kept garden, and children who were well-mannered, at least in public. They were the kind of family everyone admired from afar, always present at the neighborhood barbecues, exchanging pleasantries, and hosting gatherings. But, like many families, their picture-perfect existence hid a dark secret, one that no one could have ever imagined. Linda Johnson, a 43-year-old woman, had been through her share of hardships. Her first marriage had ended in divorce when her son, Elijah, was just a toddler. She had always been a devoted mother, but raising Elijah on her own had come with its challenges. However, she never gave up. She fought for her son, for his future, and eventually, she remarried. Michael, 55, a successful businessman, came into their lives a few years later. He brought with him his own baggage, his daughter, Sarah, who was 21 and somewhat of a mystery to Linda. Despite their differences, Linda and Michael worked hard to build a life together. Michael was often busy with work, leaving Linda to manage the home and, at times, his daughter, Sarah. Elijah was only 10 years old, so he had grown up knowing no other father than Michael. Linda had treated Sarah with kindness, though their relationship had always felt more distant than she would have liked. Sarah was independent, often keeping to herself, her focus on her own world, one that Linda couldn't fully understand. It was a typical afternoon when everything changed. Michael had gone to work, leaving the house eerily quiet. Elijah was off playing outside, and Sarah was sitting on the couch in the living room, flipping through a magazine. Linda had been busy with household chores, trying to keep her mind off the ever-present feeling of loneliness that seemed to linger around her. She sat down next to Sarah, who looked up at her and smiled, though it was a forced smile, one that Linda could see through. "Everything all right?" Linda asked, hoping to connect. Sarah, eyes on her magazine, shrugged. "Yeah, just bored." Linda hesitated for a moment. It wasn't uncommon for Sarah to be distant, but it still bothered her. "You know, I never thought we'd end up like this, living together, trying to make it work. Sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions," Linda said, her voice soft but filled with the weight of unspoken emotions. Sarah set the magazine down and looked at her, a trace of curiosity in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Linda sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know. I just feel like we're all so separate. You and me, Elijah, even Michael. We live in the same house, but sometimes it feels like we're strangers." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah seemed to genuinely listen. Linda could see the change in her, the slight softening of her gaze. It was in that moment, that quiet, vulnerable moment, that something shifted between them. Sarah, who had always been somewhat aloof, leaned closer. Their conversation, initially awkward, became more personal. Sarah began to share pieces of her life that Linda had never known about. They talked about their fears, their regrets, the things that had shaped them into who they were. It was the kind of conversation that Linda had wanted to have for years but had never known how to begin. In that space, the connection between them grew, and Linda felt an intimacy she had longed for. They were no longer just a mother and a stepdaughter, they were two women sharing their lives, their secrets. But as the conversation deepened, so did the attraction that neither had expected. Linda, in a moment of vulnerability, felt something stir within her. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the loneliness, maybe it was the need to be seen, but in Sarah's presence, she felt noticed, valued. Sarah, too, seemed to feel it. The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken. Before either of them could process what was happening, they found themselves moving closer. Their words grew softer, their glances more lingering. It was as if time slowed down, and the world outside the room ceased to exist. What started as a conversation about life and regret soon became something else, a dangerous, forbidden act that neither of them could have anticipated. Neither knew how it had happened, but both found themselves in each other's arms, crossing a line that could never be undone. Their affair, as dangerous and wrong as it was, had begun. If you like the story so far, make sure to hit the like button. In the days after, guilt and desire consumed Linda and Sarah. Their home, once lively, now felt eerily silent. Michael continued his busy work routine, never suspecting the seismic shift that had taken place within the walls of his home. Linda loved Elijah and wanted to be a good mother, but her growing bond with Sarah complicated everything. What began as weakness had become something deeper, something she could no longer control. It wasn't just a physical affair, it was emotional, psychological. Every time they were together, every touch, every glance, seemed to pull them further into a web they knew they couldn't escape. For Sarah, it was the first time she felt truly close to someone. Her father was distant, her mother absent. Linda's kindness evolved into something deeper, intoxicating. Despite the risks, Sarah willingly became more entangled in their affair, craving the warmth, understanding, and sense of being truly wanted. They continued their secret meetings, slipping away when Michael was at work or when Elijah was preoccupied with his own activities. They would spend hours together in Linda's bedroom, talking, laughing, sometimes doing nothing at all except basking in the closeness that neither of them had known they needed. It was as if they were living in their own world, shut off from the rest of the family, locked in their own forbidden intimacy. But no secret stays hidden forever. The lie, as delicate as it seemed, was beginning to crack at the edges. 2 months had passed since that first fateful encounter, and both Linda and Sarah had convinced themselves that they had learned to navigate the dangers of their situation. They had become more careful, more calculated, knowing that they were walking a razor-thin line. They couldn't risk being caught, especially not now. But it was only a matter of time before the tension would spill over into something neither could control. One evening, their fragile balance began to crumble. Michael, always punctual, was expected after 8 p.m. Confident in their secrecy, Linda and Sarah indulged in stolen moments. As time passed, they relaxed, unaware that their carefully maintained illusion was about to shatter with Michael's unexpected early arrival. But fate had other plans. At just before 7:30, Linda and Sarah were in her room, wrapped up in the comforting cocoon of their shared secret. The door to the bedroom was shut, the blinds drawn, and the house was quiet, too quiet. The sound of footsteps on the stairs sent a ripple of panic through both of them. Michael was home earlier than expected. Neither of them had heard the car pull into the driveway, and now, with no time to hide, they were trapped. As the door to the bedroom opened, Linda's heart skipped a beat. Michael's voice called out from the hallway. "I'm home," he announced, his tone casual, but filled with curiosity. Panic surged through both women as they scrambled to gather themselves, desperate to cover up the situation. They froze in place, trying to think quickly. After what seemed like an eternity, Sarah, with a feigned calmness, spoke first. She had always been better at keeping her composure under pressure. "I was just showing Linda my new dress," she lied smoothly, a quick smile playing on her lips as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Michael seemed to buy the explanation. He didn't ask any more questions, seemingly satisfied with the answer. But the tension in the room was palpable, and Linda felt a lump form in her throat. They had come so close to being caught. If Michael had arrived just a few minutes later, if they hadn't been quick enough to cover their tracks, the entire world they had built would have collapsed in an instant. As Michael went downstairs, none the wiser, Linda and Sarah exchanged a glance, both of them silently acknowledging how close they had come to losing everything. They knew they had to be more careful, more calculated. There could be no more moments of recklessness. They couldn't afford to get caught. It was becoming clear that their secret had reached a breaking point. That night, as Linda lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind raced with thoughts of what they had almost lost. She thought of Elijah, of how the family had seemed so perfect once, and how easily it could all be destroyed by one mistake. She was no longer sure if she even wanted to keep the secret anymore. There was a part of her that longed for the truth to come out, to stop pretending. But then, the fear of the consequences took over. She couldn't risk losing everything, especially not now. The next day, the weight of what had almost happened hung over them. Linda and Sarah became even more cautious in their interactions, speaking in hushed tones, carefully planning their moments together. The tension between them grew, and with it, an even deeper sense of dread. As they tiptoed around the house, trying to avoid detection, they couldn't help but feel that something was about to break. But neither could have predicted how quickly everything would fall apart. The seeds of their downfall had already been sown, and there was no turning back now. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the inevitable happened. Elijah, ever curious and full of energy, had been outside playing in the yard, his laughter echoing through the house. It had been one of those rare moments when the family was all together, and Linda felt a sense of normalcy return to her life. But the sense of peace was fleeting. As the day wore on, Linda and Sarah found themselves alone again in the house, the kind of solitude they had grown accustomed to. They were in the living room, talking in low tones, discussing the state of their affair and how much longer they could keep it a secret. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken fear of being caught hanging in the air. But amidst the weight of their conversation, neither of them noticed the quiet footsteps on the stairs. Elijah had been curious about his mother and Sarah. He had always looked up to Sarah as a big sister, someone who had been more of a role model to him than Linda's previous boyfriends or father figures. So when he had walked up the stairs and toward Linda's bedroom, intending to ask her something trivial about school, he never expected what he would find. Through the slightly ajar door, Elijah saw his mother and Sarah, not as the figures he had always known them to be, but in a way he couldn't comprehend. They were sitting too close, their faces inches apart. And then, his heart sank. He saw the unspoken intimacy between them, the closeness that should not have existed between a mother and her daughter. Their lips were almost touching when Elijah's wide eyes locked on the scene. His world felt like it was crumbling in that moment. Confusion, shock, and 1,000 questions surged through him. He stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, everything around him seemed to spin. He had seen enough to understand that something was terribly wrong, but his young mind couldn't process the gravity of what he had just witnessed. Panicking, Elijah bolted from the house, running as fast as his legs could carry him. He didn't know what to do, or who to turn to. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear: he had to escape from the chaos he had just uncovered. The sudden noise of Elijah's retreating footsteps snapped Linda and Sarah out of their private world. Both women froze, the blood draining from their faces as the terrifying realization hit them: Elijah had seen them. He knew. Without thinking, Linda jumped to her feet. "Elijah," she cried out, her voice laced with panic. Sarah, equally terrified, followed her, both of them rushing toward the front door, determined to catch him before he could get too far. But Elijah was already out of sight, and their frantic chase soon led them toward the back of the house. Elijah was running toward the roof. In his mind, it felt like the only escape. He couldn't face his mother or Sarah, not after what he had seen. He was confused and frightened, his trust shattered, and his innocence lost. The only thing he wanted was to distance himself from the nightmare he had just uncovered. Linda and Sarah were close behind, calling his name in desperate attempts to calm him down. But with each step they took, they could see that Elijah wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too scared to understand that what he had seen wasn't meant for him. In his young mind, the images he had witnessed were beyond his ability to comprehend. They reached the roof just as Elijah was standing at the edge, his body trembling. "Elijah, please," Linda pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. "You have to understand, it's not what you think." But Elijah couldn't hear her. His fear had overtaken him. "I saw you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I saw everything. I don't know what's happening." Sarah stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Elijah, please," she said softly, trying to reach him. "It's not what it looked like." But the fear in Elijah's eyes told them it was too late. The distance between them had grown too wide, the trust too broken for words to mend the rift. In a moment of sheer panic, Linda stepped forward, her emotions running wild. She was terrified, not just for herself, but for Sarah, for the life they had built, and for the consequences of the secret that was now exposed. Without thinking, she reached out, pushing Elijah gently to get him to listen, to calm down. But in that instant, Elijah lost his footing. The world seemed to slow as he stumbled backward, his arms flailing, trying to grasp onto something, anything, to stop his fall. And then, in a tragic, heart-stopping moment, Elijah's body disappeared from view. The sound of his fall echoed in Linda's ears, as though the very foundation of the house had crumbled beneath her feet. She stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, unable to believe what had just happened. Elijah was gone. For a moment, time stood still. Sarah screamed, her voice high-pitched and filled with horror, but Linda couldn't move. She couldn't process what had just unfolded. She had just pushed her son to his death. It was an accident, yes, but the consequences were irreversible. As the gravity of the situation hit them both, panic set in. They had to cover up what had happened, there was no choice. The secret, their secret, was now tangled with an even darker truth. Linda and Sarah exchanged a look, a silent agreement forming between them. They knew they had to act quickly. But the lies they would tell couldn't undo the tragedy that had just unfolded. Elijah was gone, and the family they had tried so desperately to protect was now forever broken. After Elijah's fall, Linda and Sarah stood at the edge of the roof, gazing at the spot where Elijah had disappeared. They couldn't believe Elijah was gone. But amidst the overwhelming grief, one thought gripped their minds: how do we cover this up? Linda turned to Sarah, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to say it was an accident. He was just playing, and he fell. No one can know the truth." Sarah, equally shaken, nodded. "We'll stick to the story. No one will question it. We just need to stay calm." The two of them worked quickly, trying to make the scene look like a tragic accident. They carried Elijah's lifeless body inside and positioned it so it appeared as though he had fallen while playing outside. The word accident echoed in their minds like a mantra, providing a false comfort. But deep down, they both knew they were building a house of lies. When Michael arrived home that evening, the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. He immediately noticed the somber mood that hung over the family. Linda and Sarah were quiet, almost too quiet, and their faces were drawn with worry. "Where's Elijah?" Michael asked, his voice filled with concern. He's been hurt," Linda said, struggling to maintain control of her emotions. "He fell outside. It happened so quickly." Michael's heart dropped. He rushed past them, his mind racing with fear. When he saw Elijah lying lifeless in the yard, he stumbled back, his stomach turning in knots. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Linda and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. They had rehearsed the story, but the pressure was building. "It was just an accident," Sarah said, her voice tight. "He was running around, and he slipped. It all happened so fast." Michael's eyes searched their faces, trying to make sense of what was happening. He knelt by Elijah's side, checking for a pulse that wasn't there. His heart broke as the reality of the situation hit him. But even as he grieved, something felt off. Why was there no one around when it happened? Why was he alone outside? Michael's instincts told him something wasn't right, but grief clouded his judgment. The police arrived soon after. Linda and Sarah maintained the same story, an accident. They described how Elijah had been running around, lost his balance, and tragically fell. The officers took down their statements and left, satisfied with the explanation. But even with the officers gone, the unease lingered. Something still didn't sit right with Michael. Despite his overwhelming sadness, there was a nagging feeling that the story didn't make sense. How had Elijah gotten onto the roof in the first place? Why had neither Linda nor Sarah been able to catch him in time? It wasn't long before the police were back, this time with a discovery that would change everything. A neighbor had come forward with security camera footage from the night of the incident. The footage, though grainy, clearly showed the moments leading up to Elijah's fall. It revealed Linda and Sarah on the roof with Elijah, just before he lost his balance and fell. The footage completely contradicted the story they had told the police. The truth had come to light, not through Michael's suspicions, but through the evidence the police had uncovered. The lie they had tried so desperately to maintain was now shattered. The next day, the police arrived at the house to confront Linda and Sarah. They faced the officers, their secret exposed. Under intense questioning, Linda was the first to crack. Her fear, her guilt, and the weight of what had happened overwhelmed her. "It wasn't an accident," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't mean for him to fall, but it happened. We were on the roof with him, and he slipped." The confession came out in a rush, as if the truth had finally escaped from her lips. But there was more. She couldn't hide the full extent of what had happened. As the police pressed for more details, Linda broke down further. She explained the events that led up to Elijah's death and, eventually, the shocking truth about her and Sarah's affair. The weight of her confession was too much to bear, and as she spoke, the life they had built together crumbled around them. Sarah, unable to deny the truth any longer, also confessed. The affair between her and Linda was revealed to the officers in full, the depth of their deception exposed for the world to see. The police continued their investigation, collecting more evidence, including witness testimonies and the damning footage. The truth was now undeniable. As the investigation continued, the community that had once admired the Johnson family began to turn against them. Neighbors who had once seen the family as a symbol of suburban bliss were now shocked by the betrayal and lies that had been hidden behind closed doors. Linda and Sarah were arrested, and the weight of their actions pressed down on them. Their world had been turned upside down, and now they would face the consequences of their choices. With their arrest, there was no escaping the truth. The trial was a spectacle that everyone in the community had been waiting for. Linda and Sarah sat together in the dock, their faces pale and anxious. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the prosecution prepared to present their case. The once peaceful and perfect Johnson family was now a shattered image of what they had once been, and the public could hardly believe how far they had fallen. The prosecutor began by outlining the tragic events leading up to Elijah's death. The jury listened intently as the prosecution detailed the affair between Linda and Sarah and how it spiraled into a moment of panic on the roof. They presented the CCTV footage from the neighbor's camera, which showed Linda, Sarah, and Elijah on the roof just moments before the fall. The footage was damning, and there was no escaping the truth. Linda's defense tried to argue that her actions had been an accident, that she had never intended for Elijah to fall to his death. They painted her as a grieving mother who had made a mistake in the heat of the moment. They pleaded for the jury to consider her state of mind, to show some mercy. But the evidence was too strong, and the truth too undeniable. The prosecution didn't waste time. They painted a vivid picture of the tragic events. Elijah had witnessed something he shouldn't have, and in the panic that followed, Linda had pushed him in a moment of frustration. The push had sent Elijah stumbling backward, and before anyone could react, he had fallen. His death was not an accident, it was a consequence of the lies that had been buried for too long. As the trial continued, Michael, who had been silent for most of the proceedings, stood up and addressed the court. His voice cracked with emotion, but his words were clear. "Elijah was my son," he began. "I loved him like my own. I never imagined something like this could happen to us. We were a family, or at least I thought we were. But everything I thought I knew was a lie. I'm not just grieving the loss of my son, I'm grieving the loss of the family I thought we had." He paused, his face contorted in pain. "I don't know what's worse, the fact that I lost Elijah or that I've lost them too. I've lost everything." Michael's words hit like a punch to the gut. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his grief hanging in the air. He had lost his son, and now he was losing his wife and daughter too. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she remained quiet. Her face was impassive, betraying no emotion, but the pressure was mounting. The prosecutor's questions were sharp, and despite Sarah's attempts to stay composed, it was clear she was breaking inside. The affair, the lies, the cover-up, all of it had come crashing down, and Sarah had nowhere left to hide. Finally, after days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. Linda and Sarah sat together, their hands clasped tightly, their faces drawn with fear. Michael, sitting in the back, watched them, unable to look away. His anger and grief were still fresh, but he knew the truth was now out in the open. There was no escaping it. The jury returned after what felt like an eternity. The verdict was read aloud: guilty. Linda was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and Sarah was convicted of aiding and abetting. The room was filled with murmurs as the weight of the decision sank in. Linda's face crumpled as the verdict was read. Her tears flowed freely, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the full extent of the loss. Her son, her family, and the life she had built were gone. The sentencing was harsh. Linda was given a lengthy prison term, the consequences of her actions now set in stone. Sarah received a slightly lesser sentence, but it was clear her life would never be the same. The affair had destroyed everything. The media swarmed outside the courthouse, eager for interviews and final words from the family. But Linda and Sarah remained silent, their faces etched with regret. The public was divided, some expressed sympathy for the family's loss, while others were horrified by the betrayal. The Johnson family, once seen as the epitome of suburban perfection, had become the ultimate cautionary tale. Michael left the courtroom, his face hollow with grief. "This isn't the end," he said. "Elijah is gone, but the truth may bring some peace. I don't know how to move on, but I must try." The press snapped pictures, capturing the image of a broken man. As Linda and Sarah were led away, the weight of their actions settled on them. The secrets they had tried to bury had torn their family apart, leaving nothing but the rubble of a shattered life. The once perfect Johnson family was now just a memory, and as the years went by, the echoes of Elijah's death would haunt them forever. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like and subscribe for more.